Hello everybody and welcome to another lecture in this series. Today we're going to devote our time and energy to the understanding of memory from a psychological perspective. And if there was ever a topic in psychology that's important for students, it's the topic of memories. So I think you're going to actually benefit from this section of our course, because what you learn in this particular area of psychology can help you to be a better student. Memory is one of those things that's pretty important. If you think about it, it really relates to just about everything we do. And if you think why we need to have a memory, I could give you a whole bunch of examples. Certainly, we need to retain all kinds of information, skills, and capacities that we use day by day. If you sat in your car when you got to get up each morning, assuming you drive, and you had no idea how to drive the car, it would be a pain in the neck. Or you have no idea how, once you get off the subway, to walk home. So that certainly is important. Recognizing your loved ones, your children, is important. As you'll read about in your textbook, there are some very famous case studies of people who have quirks, can I say that, of memory, which literally allows them not to recognize their own spouse or their own children. Language and memory go together. Clearly, you couldn't speak a language if you didn't remember the words that go together with this concept or this idea, or the words that we use for the objects in our environment. Culture, including movies and Netflix and TV and novels and church and all the things that make up human culture, is dependent upon memory. In fact, many of those things have memory as a core foundation. And indeed, who we are is really a function of our memory. I was listening to a podcast recently, and the psychologist on this podcast was making the point that memory, why do we have memory? He asked, and he said it's not necessarily for us to recall everything in the past, but it's necessary for us in making decisions in the present, moving into the future, to use memory so that we don't constantly make mistake after mistake after mistake. Ideally, memory goes to the core of who we are. It informs our present and therefore our future selves. And beyond that, memory is in some ways an addition to learning, because remember that we define learning as a relatively permanent change in past experience. Well, if I don't remember my learning, then I haven't learned it. And so you can see it's a pretty important topic. In terms of going through memory, here's our definition. And you can see the similarity with learning, persistence of learning over time, again, through the storage and retrieval of information and skills. There are three behaviors really that show memory is functioning, and think of these as almost types of tests that you have taken in the past. The first would be recall, where you can recall something. That would be kind of like a fill-in-the-blank type test. In other words, you have to generate the specific item from your memory. Second would be recognition. This would be like a multiple choice test. In other words, you don't have to generate it from scratch. You just have to look at the options in front of you and select the one which you recognize as being the correct one. And finally, a third aspect here is relearning. Because of memory, we never really, quote unquote, forget anything. That all learning after the initial time is relearning, and when we relearn, or when we engage with content or some skill the second and subsequent times, even if there's 30 or 40 years, it does not take as long as it did the first time. So that if you rode a bike when you were 8 and then at 58 decided you're going to learn how to ride a bike again, even though 50 years have gone by, the memory of the bike and using the bike and we'll call this on some level muscle memory or implicit memory of what's the best way to do this will be there, so your learning curve will be much faster than learning something the first time. Now, how does memory work? Well, we could simply say that there are three pretty much things that go into memory. The first would be the encoding of experience or information into our brain in some way that allows it to be stored, and then clearly the storage is another part of it. Effective storage, is storage that allows you for quick retrieval. Just imagine any time you've tried to organize some closet or organize some, I don't know, some set of objects in your house. There are thousands of ways to organize, and indeed, they're not all created equal. Some are more efficient at retrieval than others. And of course, then there's the process of retrieval, going back and getting what was stored and then bringing it into present awareness and memory, and being able now to think about something you remember, or to use something you remember, or to recall the answer to some kind of question. That's really a simplified version, and clearly it's way more complicated than that. Now, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model from the late 1960s is the kind of go-to model for how memory works, and you can see on the bottom of your screen below we have a bunch of things we want to talk about. So if you look at right in the left-hand corner, there's external events, and again, the first type of memory is what we call sensory memory. We'll talk about that here in a little second. It's almost like you have a little video recorder, which is taking in its sensory information, but it's a very small window. For that information to stay, we have to select for what's important and what's not important. I don't know if you've ever been talking to someone and they say to you, hey, are you here? Where are you? And it's a good example of how sometimes we're selecting certain information in sensory input, and we're not paying attention to the person in front of us. So there's some encoding that has to take place for it to get into working memory. Now, working memory is where the present environment or situation is combined with past memory, and so we select on what in our present environment we're going to pay attention to in terms of sensory input, and then working memory is where we kind of combine that in some way with what we already know, because none of us interacts with the world in a completely, present way. I'm always hearing about be mindful of this, be mindful, mindfulness practice. Mindfulness is really trying to concentrate on the here and now, and it can be helpful, but most of us can only do that for very short periods of time, because the way our brains work is we're constantly relating what we already have experienced on one level or another with the present. Then there's some more encoding for that to go into long-term memory. Not everything in working memory is going to make it into long-term memory. This encoding process, what's been called consolidation, there's some things that lead to that, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Clearly, though, if you go back to working memory, there's retrieving. There's not only encoding going in from working memory into long-term memory, but there's also retrieval, because as I'm relating to my present environment, let's say I meet a new person and this person reminds me of a previous person I knew by virtue of the way they talk or their jokes or whatever. So there's constant encoding, constant retrieval between working memory and long-term memory. Now, there's an automatic process kind of jump all the way from external events into long-term memory, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but there are some things we just automatically process. They don't have to go through sensory and through working memory. They automatically we're just, it's like automatic payments every month. and we'll talk about those. Right smack in the middle, that arrow that says attention to important or novel information in terms of the encoding from sensory information to working information. This is an important point, that when we're doing something and all of a sudden something strange happens, something really interesting, something out of the ordinary, something loud, something to get our attention is what we'd say. Whatever we're paying attention to will switch attention, because our brains are, can I say, primed to register new, novel, important, interesting information. And so this is the model that we used. And as I said before, number 2 here, rehearsal and then long-term memory. I should have put that up there, but you can read it now. In terms of this model, since 1968, so the last 40, 45, 50 years, basically we should point out that some things have changed, and one of the things that's changed is the emphasis on working memory. We used to call it short-term memory, but working memory is a little more accurate, and so now we call it both. But the idea here with working memory is it's not just short-term. There's kind of intention and selection from what's in my environment to attend to, and that's why we call it working memory. More to come. Now, in terms of going from stimuli to short-term memory, we have this sensory memory. As I mentioned before, sensory memory is a very quick slice of time in which it's almost like all the senses in your body records sound and imagery, and but it's constantly diminishing. It's a Instagramming, kind of like disappearing kind of video clip in which we have all sensory information coming in. Now, in terms of working memory, we want to talk about 3 different aspects of working memory. The first on the left is called the auditory rehearsal. The more common name for this is the phonological loop, P-H-O-N-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L, like phonology. So the phonological loop is just basically the auditory rehearsal that we sometimes engage in. So someone tells you a phone number and you just kind of keep repeating it to yourself. So it's almost the rehearsal we use for sound. Then on the right we have what's called the visuospatial sketchpad. It's the visual aspect, the visualization. If someone's giving you directions and they're saying, okay, go down, make a left on this street and then go to the white church on the right and make a right a street after that. So it's almost the visualizations that we're making. So we have the sound, we have the visualizations, and the executive functions, or what some psychologists call the central executive aspect of working memory. This is the part of working memory that takes not only the sound and the visual information that we're imagining, but then combines those with past memory. In other words, trying to retrieve from past experiences similar events, things that can help, little hooks that we can connect the information to. So in some ways, this short-term / working memory even itself is relatively complicated with the visual information, the auditory information, and again this central executive, which is taking both of those and coordinating it with all information we have stored in long-term memory. Now, when we talk about the processing of memories, and we need to make a differentiation here between what are called declarative or explicit memories. These are memories of things that we can recall. So I can talk about, yeah, I went to Starbucks yesterday, or I took a hike here, or yeah, my favorite friend in 10th grade was named Joe or whatever. So these are explicit because we can describe them, They're declarative because we can declare them. We can consciously recall and relate them. Now, these memories are almost all mostly engaged through what we call effortful processing. In other words, we put some effort. I'm not saying we have to necessarily study, but there is effort that we engage in to remember these things. And when they go into long-term memory, they're explicit, they're declarative, and they're effortful. The other type of memory is kind of interesting because it's called implicit memories, and we automatically process these. In other words, implicit memories are not memories that are declarative, but it's a sense of things. It's a gut feeling for things. So, for instance, you may, let's say someone they were abused when they were an infant. Well, they might not remember the actual abuse, but almost the emotional memory or the sense that something was wrong. That would be an example of implicit memories, and these are automatically processed, and they again are almost kind of unconscious memories. We have them, but when I say unconscious, we don't seem to be consciously be able to relate them specifically. I hope that wasn't too confusing. Now, in terms of automatic processing of stuff, there are some messages, some information which we automatically process. Again, implicit memories, a lot of times emotional memories, certain conditioned associations. This is what's at the root of, say, a phobia. Is you have a conditioned memory. It may be disconnected from the original experience, but you know, for instance, that you're afraid of dogs. You may not remember getting bit by a dog or ever having a negative experience. Procedural memory is also one of the things that we remember: how to do something, how to ride a bike, how to drive a car, how to I recall recently being on a motorcycle, and I hadn't ridden a motorcycle in 20 years, although I still have a motorcycle license. And I thought, wow, but almost within just 20, 30 seconds, I felt extremely comfortable on exactly how to ride a motorcycle. So procedural information, we tend to automatically process space, time, frequency. So for instance, where I was generally, about what time of day generally or year, about how many people were there, or about how many of this or that. Automatic processing is hugely beneficial to us simply because we don't have to put energy and effort into remembering these things. Now, it's not necessarily always going to be exactly clear. So for instance, if I was in a room and there were 12 people there, I might remember it was about 10. So it's not that this kind of processing is going to be 100% accurate, but I have a general sense. I know it was about 10, I know it wasn't 100, and I know it wasn't 3. Now, in terms of sensory memory, we already talked about this a little bit. Sensory memory, again, is this brief sensory information in terms of vision and auditory and touch and so on and so forth. And it's very, very short, 3 to 4 seconds, pretty much, and then it's gone, or a 20th of a second in terms of the visual information. We have all had the experience when we're talking to somebody, as example I gave before, and they said, "Are you listening to me?" And you say yes, and then they say, "Well, what did I just say?" And most of us can, at least for the 3 or 4 or 5 seconds before they ask us that question, kind of repeat back to them. But from 20 seconds ago or 30 seconds ago, nah, we can't remember. And so if you're ever in that situation, you ask someone, "Are you listening to me?" And they say yes, and you say, "What did I just say?" And they repeat it. Say, "What did I just say? Before that." Before that, you'll easily be able to catch them because they weren't listening to you. Okay, in terms of the capacity of short-term or working memory, the famous information on this is from 1920 George Miller, who basically gave the 7 plus or minus 2 formula for how much information is in working or short-term memory at any given point. And the research shows it's a little more particular. We can remember 7 digits or numbers. We can remember 6 letters. And I don't know why letters are harder to remember than digits, or about 5 words. Again, 5 distinct units of meaning. Now, again, with working memory, we can use rehearsal, and we can use any number of things to constantly remember that. We'll talk about some of these, but the 7 plus or minus 2 seems to be about right. Okay, let's take a little test. You're going to see some letters and numbers appear at the bottom of the screen. So ignore the hyphen. The first letter is going to be V. The first one of these is going to be V. So what I'm going to do is have them scroll back, and if you have a paper pen in front of you, as soon as it gets done, I want you to try and write down as many as you can. Okay, you ready? And then we'll see if you can get this right. Or if you don't have a pen there, just try and remember as many as you can. Okay, here we go. Okay, so take a second and go ahead and write that down, and we'll give you a little chance to pause here. Okay, I'm going to reveal the actual ones to you. See how well you did on this. VM3CAQ9LD. VM3CAQ9LD. How'd you do? That's pretty good. I'm impressed. Now, in terms of engaging in some other techniques here, again, we have this 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. Why can we remember 5 words where there's a lot more letters in 5 words than 7? Well, clearly the 5-word thing is we're not remembering the letters in the words, but actually the words have meaning to them, whereas letters don't. For most of us, just random letters and numbers don't have meaning. So in the meaning, as we read a word, there's a resonance inside of our brain that automatically clicks with past memory. And so words are a little easier on some level, even though we can remember 5. It's a lot more information for our brains, but because of the units of meaning, they're easier to retrieve. Indeed, this is what we do when we attempt to study for a test. We engage in effort, and that effort is our intentionality to try and cram this information in so we can later retrieve it. Now, I just want to give you some examples of how we do this. Chunking, mnemonics, and so on. You can read there on your right, because clearly if you could understand and learn this information and apply it, it might make you a better student, and you can send me $20 through the mail. Let's talk about some of these. Chunking is one of these things where we take those units of meaning, or the letters or the numbers, and we pretty much put them into a chunk. We almost kind of create a word out of them, although it's not a word. This is why your credit card always is in four number chunks. Simply because, it's like 5521, 7712, blah, 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 blah. That's how we do it. I was a little worried I was going to give you my credit card there. But that's why credit cards are in that. And if you can chunk information, if you can cluster whatever you're trying to study into information and put it into a chunk, and then remember the chunks, you will be able to recall a lot more information. Again, if you had all of these letters, and how are you going to remember that? But if you put it into meaningful groups, and now we can't all do this, but you'll get this. You can see that basically X for KISS, IDK for I don't know, KFC for the chicken, FBI for the organization apparently going after Trump. Sorry. BA for the degree, hopefully you'll get soon. NAACP for the African American organization. CVS for the great drugstore. SUV for the overpriced four-wheel drive car, and so on and so forth. So letters can be hugely you can remember so many more letters if you can chunk them. And again, what are you almost doing? You're almost creating an image in almost a manageable unit. For being able to get this into memory. A second device for helping long-term memory is mnemonic devices. So plain, cigar, do, shall, candy, vague, pizza, seam, fire, pencil. Okay, so what are those words do you think are easier to remember? Well, a mnemonic device would tell us that if you decided to write down the words you can remember, I'm not going to take the time to do that, but what most people do remember is a word that has a clear image associated with it. A pencil, a cigar, pizza, as opposed to the word shall or the word commit. I don't even remember, commit's not on there. Or the word do, or the word seam. There's no image to that. So a mnemonic device pretty much is a device in which we attach an image. I remember reading a little, article on how to remember people's names. And one of the things that they suggested you do is when you meet somebody, hey, I'm Steven, and you shake their hands and they say their name in your mind. Immediately after you say the name, repeat the name and actually repeat it out loud. Mark! And then think of some image. Think of a tree. Think of a piece of a candy. Think of a house. Think of an alligator or whatever. Some image. And again, if that image, the image doesn't actually have to do anything to do with the person, but you just pick an image and you say the name out loud. Think of that image, and then 3 or 4 times as the person begins to talk, just say Mark Alligator, Mark Alligator. Think of an alligator, and you'll much more likely remember their name, because what you're doing is you're attaching an image, not just the image of their face, because we know a lot of people, but image of not only their face but something else. So a mnemonic is just some mental trick in which we attach information to something else. Clearly the peg word system is another example of that. Do can be pictured on a door, and a door equals 4. So you're writing something do on a door, and a door is 4. It's just simply a series of words in which you peg the concept you want with other information in your brain. Now, why would this work? Because when you go to access the information, you almost have multiple ways of going back and channels, if you will, of getting the information. Another important task in short-term memory to get stuff into long-term memory is using categories or hierarchies, kind of outlines. I know that my go-to way in studying all the way through school and college and graduate school was outlining. Outlines just organized it for me. That's why I love taking essay tests, because if you just had the outline in your mind, then you just fill in the words and make them up, as long as you get the correct ones in there, hopefully in the correct places. So again, here's an outline of what we've been talking about here. And the good thing about outlines too is it shows that which is the kind of the overarching category, which are the ones underneath it, which are the ones underneath those. So again, think of an outline of edible objects, and then underneath that you might have fruit, vegetables, and then under fruit you might have citrus. You might have I don't know, what's another kind of fruit? Grapes. Under citrus you might have tangerines, limes, lemons, oranges. Again, under oranges, you might have navel oranges and this type of orange. So hierarchies and categories are good strategies. Here's another way to do it where we just use boxes. So effortful encoding and effortful processing, and again, sensory memory, the capacity of short-term memory, and then under effortful strategies so far we've talked about chunking, hierarchies, mnemonics. So these are simply ways to do that. Now, another thing we can do is engaged in mass practice, which is just cramming information at once. Now, we don't want to say that mass practice never works. It certainly does work. I have certainly crammed for a test and done very, very well on tests, and I'm sure you have. We do have to point out that it doesn't tend to work best over time. So Herbert Ebbinghaus, a very important figure in the study of memory, you'll read about him, said that you'll have better retention and recall over the long run if instead of studying for 1 hour, you studied 6 days for 10 minutes. In other words, if it's information that you need to have beyond, the test that you're going to take tomorrow morning, then it's much better to space your studying over time. You'll be more efficient, you'll retain more, and it simply means that because what you're doing is you're allowing the time in between for that information to consolidate in your brain, and you're also kind of rehearsing it every time you go back to it. Every day I go back to it. You're rehearsing it. You're recalling, and then not just consolidating, but reconsolidating. And with every reconsolidation into long-term memory over the next 6 days, just 10 minutes a day, if you will, you're strengthening that memory in storage, and because it's a stronger memory in storage, retrieval is likely to be more efficient and more effective. So the testing effect here clearly is distribute your studying over time, and also practice in your studying, testing yourself. This is why I love giving, for a lot of my classes, study guides, because, and maybe some of my fellow professors say, well, study guide, you're handing everybody the questions. Well, yeah, I guess, but you still have to learn them. You still have to be able to recognize the material. I think study guides are hugely, if you use them, if you have a study guide and you have a test coming up, man, take 6 days in a row and go over that and then test yourself. You'll do really, really well on that test. In terms of another strategy, I don't know how much of a strategy this is, but psychologists have talked about what is called deep or semantic processing, which is trying to understand the material. This I may be Captain Obvious here, but there's a way in which we can get material and regurgitate it later onto a test. But if you can understand why or how the material works, in other words, if you can embed certain material within the context of other material, you're just much more likely to remember it. So deep or semantic processing, you're much more likely to remember, for instance, if you understand the meaning of a word rather than just the sound of a word, and again, just the appearance of letters. So you can see that I could look at letters together. I could look at letters together and then say it out loud. And then instead of just saying it out loud, understand what the word means. With each level, you are embedding that memory, consolidating that memory stronger and stronger. And again, if you do that, you'll have better retrieval. I'm going to skip that test. If you can make memory, the stuff you have to remember, somehow relatable to you. Hey, listen, you're the center of your universe and I'm the center of my universe. The world revolves around me as the world revolves around you. So if I can relate information to me, since I'm very rarely going to forget information about me, if I can somehow connect it to me, it's called a self-referencing effect, I'm much more likely to remember it. Why? Because I have quite a lot of very detailed information about myself, and so that's already embedded in my memory. And so if I'm trying to learn new information and I can somehow relate it to me, so if you're trying to study history and you can, I don't know, you need to remember, like say, 100 different people, important people in the past. If as you try to memorize this 100 important people, if you can think about how that person relates to you. Obviously, if you're a woman and this person's a woman, just think of, this important person as a woman. Or, you see a picture of them and they have red hair and you have red hair. The self-reference effect certainly is another way to make stuff interesting. Now, in terms of capacity, there used to be a metaphor for the brain that's kind of like a computer. Once we invented computers, we quickly thought, well, the brain is like a computer. But the brain's storage capacity is not like like a hard drive on your computer. The hard drive is going to get full, and the way the brain works is much more in a kind of process way. The brain doesn't get full. It simply more elaborately makes connections and rewires itself and provides and establishes more connections. Again, think about this. Your brain has the most amazing way on the fly to change, to process, to retrieve, and what allows your brain to be more and more and more efficient, not just at remembering things, but then retrieving those things at a useful time when it's appropriate. You want hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, millions and millions and millions of synaptic connections. In other words, you want your brain to be highly, not only rewired, but very, very wired. And when you practice something, when you learn something new and embed it in knowledge, what you're essentially doing is not making your brain bigger, but rewiring it for greater efficiency. That's really what we're talking about with the brain. Memories themselves are not just stored. So if you have a memory of something, the visual information may go to one part of the brain, the auditory information, the sequence of the information, the emotional content. So actually when you have a memory, your brain has to reconstitute the memory, actually put it back together from scratch. And so in some ways, this protects aspects of memory. We certainly know there's research that shows, for instance, that rats that had a certain part of their brain destroyed, let's say, in which memories are typically located for doing something, they still, again, could perform certain tasks, even though that part of the memory, that part of the brain had been destroyed. So the storage of memory is distributed throughout the brain, and we're still a little, it's still somewhat of a mystery exactly how this works. But indeed, the idea of the brain as a computer is completely wrong. Now, once we store memory in the brain, again, how does it get there? Well, there are different storage and retrieval systems for explicit and for implicit and procedural memory. And I just want to mention these and go over them pretty quickly. Emotion becomes a very, very important aspect of memory. So, for instance, we know that if there's an intense emotion that you have, good or bad, you are much more likely to remember all the information around that intense emotional memory, because high levels of emotion signal to the brain that this is important. Why would we have such a high level of emotion? Why would we be so profoundly anxious if this wasn't something we needed to remember and then avoid it in the future? So the mechanisms for storing in the brain are a little bit different. So for explicit declarative memories, facts, stories, sequences of things, vocabulary words, parts of a neuron and so on and so forth, this memory processing and retrieval goes through the frontal lobes. Particularly the encoding and storage are facilitated by the hippocampus, part of the limbic system. So events and facts are held in the hippocampal area, and they're consolidated, and by this process of consolidation, they are then kind of sent to the brain for long-term storage. And believe it or not, very important to this process is sleep. So as a student, it's very important for you to get enough sleep when you're studying for tests, because it actually facilitates the storage process. And if you can facilitate the storage process for sleep, the retrieval process is going to be that much easier. When we look at implicit memories, essentially what we do through implicit memories is we use different mechanisms of the brain. So the cerebellum here and the basal ganglia next to the thalamus, those aspects that go into implicit memory. Again, the basal ganglia is how to do something, big procedural memory. Cerebellum is all about classical conditioning, particularly huge emotional responses. That process of the cerebellum and basal ganglia tend to affect implicit memory. So even the types of memories we have are going to be stored very, very different ways. And so clearly accessing them depends on how we stored them. You all know, if I could ask you, do you have any memories of before age 3? And this has historically been called infantile amnesia. And indeed, the reality here is we don't have many explicit memories before age 3. And so psychologists say that infants had amnesia and they had no memory. And by the way, this is why doctors sometimes would just do surgery on babies without any anesthesia, because they reason, well, the baby's not going to remember, even though the baby's screaming in pain. They're not going to remember anyway, so what's the big deal? Yow. It turns out we do have memory before age 3, not explicit memory, but absolutely we have implicit memory. So again, the baby might not remember the pain, but what they might have is an emotional memory of something very, very bad happening to them, traumatic happening to them from infancy. Talk to any counselor and they'll tell you absolutely trauma before the age 3 can have a lifelong, profound effect on someone, even if they have no memory of the event, because they have no explicit memory of the event, but implicit memory. Now, why is this? Well, again, the encoding processes here are one explanation. I think more important than the encoding processes is really the fact that language comes in, and language in some ways becomes the software of our brain. Again, if I asked you to recall a memory, you can recall it, but in recalling it and then telling me about the memory, what do you use? Language. Now, there may be images in there as well, imagistic memory, but one theory, and it's the theory that I kind of subscribe to, is that explicit memories almost require language. They almost require a software of words to describe the memory, whereas implicit memories don't. Again, procedure and emotion and so on and so forth. So those are the theories on emotional memory. Emotion is a huge facilitator to memory. There are hundreds of research studies which show that you can clearly increase memory by producing high emotional content. You may want to try this sometime. I sometimes joke around with my on-campus classes. Let's say you had a really, really important test, and it was really, really important for you to, to do well on this test. Well, what you might want to do is go out and get a bucket of ice, and I might have mentioned this in an earlier lecture. Dump the ice, a bag of ice, into a bucket and fill it up with water till it's nice and melty and the water is really cold. Study for half an hour and then stick your hand in that bucket of ice for as long as you can stand it. You will be in pain. Pain almost always causes a high emotional response. And believe it or not, the research shows that you are much more likely to remember the half an hour of stuff you studied before that. Then let your hand thaw out, study half an hour more, use your other hand, then maybe use your foot, then you can get back to the original hand. Do that all night as you're studying. You will do better on the test. Take Stephen's word for it. So emotions are really, really important. And one type of emotional memory is called flash bulb memories, just like a flash bulb in the dark. It's almost like an automatic, vivid experience is burned into our retina, so to speak. Not just our retina, but obviously into our long-term memory. And clearly, traumatic events are the most obvious examples of this. We joke about how you can't unsee something, and that's just called a flashbulb memory. Now, not all flashbulb memories are due to trauma. They could be due to any number of other things. And indeed, we have to be careful because they're not sometimes as accurate in terms of the content as the emotional content would seem to indicate. Because for instance, when we're experiencing a trauma, it makes sense that we would store the memory, but indeed the information and the detailed information may be a little fuzzy because we're paying attention to our high levels of anxiety as we're experiencing the trauma, and we may not remember, what day it was or certain other information. Now, again, to go on this a little further, emotions trigger stress hormones by definition, particularly negative emotions. Stress hormones, in turn, trigger activity in the amygdala, which is located right next to the hippocampus, which tends to, again, be very important in storing long-term memories. And again, the amygdala increases the memory-forming activities in terms of the frontal lobes and basal ganglia to almost brand or tag these memories as really, really important. You put all those things together, and it's no wonder that when we think of the memories from our childhood, we're much more likely to remember, for instance, 9/11 than 9/10 or 9/9. And even what we had for breakfast, even information that really had nothing to do with the plane crashes and on 9/11. It's simply that your brain was tagged on that day. If any of you listening to were in the New York area. And really, so many of those memories I can vividly recall, particularly when I'm walking around New York, downtown, anywhere near 9/11. So pretty important in terms of doing that. So here's just a summary. So we have automatic memories, which takes place on the left over there with implicit. It's processed in the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. There are some things that are automatically processed: procedure, space, time, frequency, all kinds of classical conditioning. In terms of effortful processing, this would be declarative or explicit memories. This is processed in the hippocampus and frontal lobes of the brain, and left and right frontal lobes. And this, again, includes facts and knowledge and personal specific information relating to me or Netflix that I've seen, so on and so forth. That's how it goes. Now, in terms of retrieval, we talked about at the beginning of this lecture recall, recognition, and relearning. Again, recall certainly important. Some of us have a better capacity of that than others. I know someone who remembers every single phone number and every single address that has been important to them. I can barely remember the phone number I have now. So in terms of a recognition, one research study showed people 2,500 photos of places and people and so on and so forth. And most people could recall upwards of 90% of them. In other words, recall that they had seen them. Now, it's not perfectly accurate, but so recognition, though, is pretty important. This is why if you see someone that you think you remember, most of us look at that person and we spend some time thinking, wait, do I know you? And again, we talked about relearning. No information is ever lost once we've learned it. When we engage in a similar task, we will do it faster and quicker. There's a kind of residual effect, even in lost information, that serves to kind of speed up any kind of future learning. So what is this object over here? Do any of you recall what that is? Because you saw the object, and obviously we drew a lot of layers of squiggly lines through this. Again, it's not complete recognition, but maybe you'll recall at the beginning. Yeah, there it is. It was that log at the beginning in the first slide of this chapter. So recognition certainly is important. Now, in terms of cues for recognition, there are called retrieval cues. When we store information, it's not like there's a file for each data. As we mentioned earlier, we rewire our brain instead of just storing on a shelf somewhere, and we store information in a web of associations. Again, here's an example. There are all kinds of. Well, you almost have to think of your brain as a multi-dimensional, multi-connected layer of web. So, for instance, if you took the word apple, so what would come to your mind with the word apple? Okay, so apple would be like one of these little circles in front of us here. And so if I asked you for apple, you might say red, you might say New York City, the Big Apple, you might say a phone, you might say Adam and Eve, although that wasn't an apple. I don't know. But clearly, you might say fruit, but we could take any one of those. We could take New York City, and there'd be a whole new web of connections. And indeed, some of those connections are reconnected to the original one. So it's almost 6 degrees of separation from everything, and that's how your mind works. And so when we're thinking about something, we tend to go, almost think of these connections as a little like a road or pathway. Some are bigger roads, some are, full of weeds and they haven't been used in a while. But the bigger, well-traveled roads, this is the stuff that we use all the time. This is the stuff that we practice. Those other roads that we haven't thought about something in years, it may take us a little while to walk down that road. But in terms of retrieval, the better your roads, or can I put it this way, the more interconnected your web of information is, then the more alternate ways you have at getting information. So one retrieval tool is called priming, okay? And again, priming is simply how our mind goes down these roads. So if I asked you to define the word bark, now, define the word bark. Well, if I show you a picture of a tree and define the word bark, or I show you a dog define the word bark, what's going on here is your mind is going to be cued to go down this road as opposed to that road. Obviously, a lot of our words have different meanings. So retrieval cues just are ways in which we prompt a direction of looking for information in your brain. That's all it is we're using associations to change the direction. There's a saying in Japan, there are many roads to the top of Mount Fuji. So obviously if the top of Mount Fuji would be the information I need, well, I can go up there many, many different ways. And again, how I get to the information is myriad, but the goal is to get to the information. Priming is another example of this, and again, tree bark versus dog bark. With priming, basically all we're doing is we're making a connection and directing people's information. So, for instance, it's amazing how crazily, how we think we're all in control of ourselves, and yet how affected we are by our environment. So, people shown just a picture of money are less likely to help another person after they're given an opportunity to do so than people that weren't shown a picture of money. Children that were shown with a picture of Santa Claus, when given the opportunity, were much more generous in sharing their candy with other children. Again, people that were shown a picture of a missing child poster were much more likely to see things as indicating a certain interaction as likely being a kidnapping. You and I are primed day and night. You and I, and the way we think about things, are primed to go down this path as opposed to another path. Just as an aside, this is why what we think about, or what we direct our mind to think about, is going to prime us to go down this way or that way. So some people might say, well, it doesn't matter what you think about. No, it does matter what you think about, because what you think about is a function of what you were thinking about before you're thinking about it. And that's how thinking, and particularly the memory aspect of thinking, works, is this kind of sometimes a lot of lefts and a lot of rights road that our thinking takes, but it's not random. It is pushed and pulled this way and that way. Another aspect of memory is what we call context-dependent memory, and it's simply this, that we tend to remember things in a particular context. So imagine this. Imagine that you have a class, and there was some people in your class that you were taking. This can't be obviously an online class, but it's simply a class. And 10 years after that class ended, you saw one of those people in Florida at Disney World. Now, you may walk right by them and you're like, whoa. Now, you may recognize that you know them, but you have no idea where you know them from. And that's simply because if you were in the class with them, you would recognize them immediately. So much of our memories are dependent upon a context in which that memory was made. And if you come across information or people or objects, events in a different context, it's a little disorienting. So context-dependent memory is something that cues or primes whether we'll be able to remember something. By the way, if you can, you should probably, let's say you have a big test, if you can go to the classroom that you're going to take the test in and study in that classroom, research shows you'll do a little better. Because as you're studying, you're relating the information you're studying to the room, to that context. And so it's likely to help you somewhat in remembering. State-dependent memory is another aspect about this. And another way to say this is what's called mood-congruent memory. Mood-congruent memory is simply that if you're in a good mood and you're thinking about the past, you're much more likely to remember good memories from the past than bad memories. On the other hand, if you're in a bad mood, your brain is much more likely to go to bad memories in the past. This is why we've all heard the advice, don't make any big decisions when you're in a highly emotional state, be it good or bad, because you're not considering all the variables. So if you're in a good mood now, chances are, if you're talking to family members, you're going to be talking about all the great things that happened in your childhood. If you're in a really bad mood and things haven't been going well for you lately, again, you'll tend to focus on bad memories, and your life with your childhood was horrible and there's nothing good about it, and so on and so forth. I like this cartoon. I wonder if you mind giving me driving lessons. I've never been sober in this part of town. Now, it's kind of funny, although it's probably real for some people. But the reality here is the state-dependent memories just says that if we're in a similar state to when the memory was made, we are much more likely to recall accurately those memories. This was a long lecture. Thank you for listening to the very end if you did, and congratulations. You are done. We'll talk to you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.